Wilson's term had come to an end, so a new election for the president was called. Wilson was once again the Democratic leader, facing off with Republican Charles Evans Hughes. Wilson's leading cause for re-electing him were promoting new freedom, which stressed individualism and states' rights, and his campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war."
Lead this people into war, and they'll forget there was ever such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into the very fiber of national life, infecting the Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street.
After elections, the votes were counted. Wilson only gathered 42% of popular votes, but an overwhelming electoral vote led him to continue his duties as the President of the United States.
My fellow citizens, the 4 years which have elapsed since I last stood in this place have been crowded with counsel and action of the most vital interest and consequence. Perhaps no equal period in our history has been so fruitful of important reforms in our economic and industrial life, or so full of significant changes in the spirit and purpose of our political action. We have sought very thoughtfully to set our house in order, correct the grosser errors and abuses of our industrial life, liberate and quicken the processes of our national genius and energy, and lift our politics to a broader view of the people's essential interests. It has been impossible to avoid them. They have affected the life of the whole world. They have shaken men everywhere with a passion and an apprehension they have never known before. It has been hard to preserve calm counsel while the thought of our own people swayed this way and that under their influence. We are a composite and cosmopolitan people. We are of the blood of all the nations that are at war. We stand firm in armed neutrality, since it seems that in no other way we can demonstrate what it is we insist upon and cannot forget. We may even be drawn on by circumstances, not by our own purpose or desire, to a more active assertion of our rights as we have seen them, and a more immediate association with the great struggle itself. But nothing will alter our thought or our purpose. They are too clear to be obstructed. They are too deeply rooted in the principles of our national life to be altered. That all nations are equally interested in the peace of the world and in the political stability of free peoples, and equally responsible for their maintenance, that the essential principle of peace is the actual equality of nations in all matters of right or privilege, that peace cannot securely or justly rest upon an armed balance of power, that governments derive all their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that no other powers should be supported by the common thought, purpose, or power of the family of nations, that the seas should be equally free and safe for the use of all peoples, under rules set up by the common agreement and consent, and that, so far as practicable, they should be accessible to all upon equal terms, that national armaments should be limited to the necessities of national order and domestic safety, that the community of interest and of power upon which peace must henceforth depend imposes upon each nation the duty of seeing to it that all influences proceeding from its own citizens meant to encourage or assist revolution in other states should be sternly and effectively suppressed and prevented. I stand here and have taken the high and solemn oath to which you have been audience, because the people of the United States have chosen me for this delegation of power, and have by their gracious judgment named me their leader in affairs. The shadows that now lie dark upon our path will soon be dispelled, and we shall walk with the light all about us, if we be but true to ourselves as we have wished to be known in the councils of the world, and in the thought of all those who love liberty and justice and the right exalted.
Wilson's re-election was arguably the main cause of the U.S. entering World War I, because, after all, he made the final decision to send them in. Although President Wilson was greatly stressing peace to get re-elected, on April 9, 1917, after war had been declared on Germany, the United States needed unity. Wilson's answer: the Committee on Public Information. The CPI was formed on April 13, 1917, to promote the war domestically while publicizing America's war aims abroad. Woodrow Wilson appointed George Creel, a U.S. war-supporting journalist, as the leader of the committee. Under Creel's lead, the CPI heavily recruited from all fields: the business, art, academia, and media. They blended the techniques advertising, while making it relatable to the United States people. Their largest success was really taking propaganda to the extreme. One of the largest successes of the CPI was the distribution of news. They distributed more than 6,000 press releases, becoming the main source for World War information. George Creel, how would you describe your success in the CPI? On any given week, the CPI could sell more than 20,000 newspaper columns gleaned with material from CPI handouts. However, the CPI didn't limit themselves to the written world. They had the most talented artists and talented cartoonists. The two types of advertising worked together. Newspapers and magazines eagerly donated advertising space, and it was impossible to pick up a periodical without encountering CPI material. Powerful posters painted in patriotic colors were plastered across billboards all across the country. In fact, posters for buying saving bonds and enlisting in the Army today were originated decades ago. As much success as the cartoonists had, the moving pictures were way more profitable, as well as more popular. The divisions of films was ensuring that the war would be noticed in the theater. Movies with titles such as Under Four Flags, America's Answer, and Pershing's Crusaders were suddenly all over American theaters because of an editorial in the Motion Picture News. Without slides, film leaders and trailers, posters and newspapers, publicity that they would spread the propaganda so necessary to the immediate mobilization of this country's great resources. One picture was so popular that Massachusetts police had to be called to stop angry mobs who had been denied admittance. The posters and motion pictures, as well as the pages of popular fiction, were a great success, yet the CPI had only begun. The word propaganda had been used many times in the past, but not as dramatically or as efficiently as the CPI. Not bombs nor bread, but words, pictures, songs, parades, and many similar devices are the typical meanings of making propaganda. Propaganda relies on symbols to attain its end, the manipulation of collective attitudes. Usually, propaganda had been used to influence one mind, but not a whole country. The Committee on Public Information changed that. Their idea was to appeal to the emotions of the reader, demoralize Germany by linking the war to various social groups, and by just flat out lying. Wartime slogans such as Bleeding Belgium, Criminal Kaiser, and Make the World Safe for Democracy clearly showed that the CPI had this technique down. It was also seen in posters saying, "Beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds." Liberty Bonds were the government's way of getting money for the war, as well as giving money to the people. A second technique of propaganda the CPI used was demonization of the enemy. So great was the psychological resistance to war in modern nations that every war must appear to be a war of defense against menacing, murderous aggressor. There must be no ambiguity without who the public is to hate. Most, if not all, the demonization was aimed at the Germans. Not only were there propaganda and posters prosecuting the Germans, but the U.S. police would remove rights from anyone that spoke German and had a German family member, or had any relation to a German, would be moved and sentenced to jail. The CPI's Vernon Kellogg asked, "Will it be if any wonder if after the war, the people of the world will then recognize any human being as a German, will shrink aside so that they may not touch him as he passes or stoop for stones to drive him from their path? Another effective technique of the CPI was to tell aristocracy stories. Although it separated the Germans and Americans even more, anti-German propaganda arose, making the U.S. take extreme matters. They renamed dachshunds to Liberty Dogs, German measles to Liberty Measles. In New York College, they reduced all German classes by a credit. 14 U.S. states banned the usage of German in schools. CPI's third strategy was called a war to end all wars. Created after Wilson's conclusion, the CPI appealed to many social groups and peace wanters by saying that World War I was the closing war. Everyone thought that and decided to fund the war. Finally, like many propaganda, the CPI was dishonest. Despite George Creel's claim that the CPI was all about accuracy, his employees later admitted that they were willing to lie. However, the CPI was still one of the most profiting propaganda companies to ever be around.